conversation. I'm perfect. There it is. I'm really this is the 2025 SHA Across the Generations conversation. My name is Lucas Kelly. I'm a professor of history at Valparaiso University, but more importantly, in this context, I'm a member of the SHA's membership committee, and I'm really thrilled to be able to sort of facilitate this conversation between two great scholars, and I'm excited for the conversation we're having. I just mentioned this earlier before we got started, but we had such a great conversation in the sort of pre-production meeting that I felt like for a moment I needed to start recording there. So if that was any indication of how great this is going to be, we're in for a really, really great treat here. Yes, so this is the third iteration of this event, this across the generations conversation. The goal of it is to promote the conference in general and kind of generate excitement in the field of Southern history, in this case, women's history and the history of the American Revolution. I wanted to introduce today our two panelists. Lorri Glover is the Bannon Endowed Chair in the History Department at St. Louis University. Her books include Founders as Fathers, The Private Lives and Politics of the American Revolution, which was published in 2014, The Fate of the Revolution, Virginians Debate the Constitution, published in 2016, and Eliza Lucas Pinckney, An Independent Woman in the Age of Revolution, published in 2020. She has edited several books with Craig Thompson Friend, including The Gendered Republic, Reimagining Identity in the New Nation, which came out this year. And she's also served as president of the Southern Historical Association for Women Historians and is currently president of the Southern Historical Association. So welcome, Lorri. Thank you so much for being willing to take part in this conversation. Our second panelist is Lauren Duval. She's an assistant professor of history at the University of Oklahoma. Her first book, The Home Front, Revolutionary Households, Military Occupation, and the Making of American Independence, will be published by the Omohundro Institute and the University of North Carolina Press in December of 2025. And don't worry, I'm going to provide links to both of these, the most recent books for these scholars in the chat momentarily. And Lauren has also published an award-winning article in the William and Mary Quarterly, as well as contributed chapters to several edited collections about the American Revolution. And she's currently in residence as a Gibson Fellow at the University of Virginia's Karsh Institute of Democracy. So welcome. I want to welcome both of our panelists to this conversation. Thank you all.
Thanks, Lucas.
Thank you so much, Lucas, for putting us together and leading the conversation.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. So, as many of you know, next year we'll be celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, and we were thinking that'd be a good sort of starting off point for our conversation. So, how do you think the field of the American Revolution has changed between the last major celebration, 1976, and 2026?
Lauren, do you want to go first, or do you want me?
You should go for it.
Well, I mean, in terms of the field of women's history, I mean, it was largely invented as a scholarly discipline. I mean, the history of women in the American Revolutionary period in the wake of the bicentennial in 1776. And when we met last week, we were, reflecting on how Linda Kerber and Mary Beth Norton's works had not yet been published. I mean, they were working in traditional fields of sort of political revolutionary era history. And so from that, the field has it's incredibly vibrant, wide-ranging, and diverse. So it's hard to capture the full scope of what has happened in those 5 decades.
I mean, I think one of the things that is so exciting in kind of recent scholarship on gender and family and the revolution is, and this is happening in the broader field on the revolution as well, but this renewed emphasis on the war itself, right? Which I think has been bringing military history into conversation with things like women's and gender history, right? Or history of slavery or indigenous history or the history of the family, as Lorri's work has done so well, right? And I think that adds new layers, right, and complexities that really broadens our understanding of the revolution and kind of where war happens, who's relevant to that telling. Because I think collectively this approach has allowed us to grasp a fuller understanding of the war, right? It's this prolonged military conflict that fundamentally upended life throughout the colonies for all different types of people, right, in ways that were often contradictory. And it tells a much more diverse history of the war, right? Because for so many people, including many women, right, like war comes to them, right, whether by force or circumstance, sometimes by choice. They are involved in the conflict, but most commonly, right, like war is showing up on their doorstep, right? And I think certainly political aspects and battles are important. They're vital parts of the revolution. But for so much of the war, what most people are navigating is kind of how to survive, right? Those political ideals are actually way less important for a lot of people in the moment than like how to protect their families, how to protect their loved ones. And I think bringing that perspective has allowed us to really tell stories that have been overlooked, and particularly is useful for talking about women's lives. Um,
And everybody's going to want to read Lauren's book because it does exactly what she's laying out. I mean, it's just fantastic. Scholarship recentering the war in the story of the American Revolution and centering women and families in that war narrative. I would also say, I mean, I think we now have a more sophisticated appreciation of the multiple revolutions that are unfolding in the late 18th century. So, I'm a big fan of Colin Calloway's work and Kathleen Duval. And so thinking about the ways in which the American Revolutionary War and the, contest over sovereignty in North America is simultaneously a struggle for sovereignty and independence in Native American nations. Scholars who work in African American history have rightly reminded us how important this long revolutionary period is in terms of the story of self-emancipation. It's the greatest self-emancipatory movement in Anglo-American history before the American Civil War. And so I think the overlapping of different kinds of revolutions and struggles for and definitions of independence is something, I mean, I certainly wasn't aware of when I started being an historian. I mean, I finished my dissertation in 1996. So even then, the scholarly field generally was so different, I think, than it is now.
I mean, you kind of both of you sort of touched on this in your answer, but I wonder if you could provide a little bit more detail on sort of where you see the field heading. Where are what are some of the things that you find most exciting? I mean, I think you did touch on some of those, but any sort of general thoughts on what's next, I guess, for the field?
I can start. I think it's kind of building off my last comment, right? But I think kind of thinking about the war as a societal experience, and particularly women's history, right? Kind of the choices that women are making in this moment allows us to really broaden our understanding of women and the revolution kind of beyond the world of political ideology, beyond Republican motherhood, right? And there's a couple of really great collections about women in the revolution that UVA has published in the last few years, including Lorri's new edited collection that's coming out. And I'm so excited to read. But I think generally speaking, right, this approach has allowed us to understand kind of the contradictory nature of women's wartime experiences, right? And I think this is something that a lot of recent scholarship is doing really well, kind of right, recognizing that the choices made by a woman like Eliza Lucas Pinckney vary really differently from those of the women she enslaved, right, or women who work in domestic service. And that to really kind of grasp that the military conflict is transforming all of these women's lives in different ways, right, in ways that often intersect with each other and can really complicate familiar narratives. And I think really putting forth this idea that there's no one single narrative of the revolution, right? Rather, they're just complicated, contradictory, entwined narratives. And kind of, we can begin untangling these stories, right? And to think more broadly about what the war means for women. And I think, there's some really great work coming out by one that comes to mind is Meg Roberts, who recently defended her PhD at Cambridge, is doing this like really innovative work on caregiving and nursing during the war, and kind of doing this great work with the history of medicine to kind of think about the work that women are doing, how they're engaging with the Army. Adam McNeil, who recently defended his PhD at Rutgers, is doing amazing work on enslaved women and their kin. And I think there's just so much more to be done, kind of probing these fields, right? Really thinking about the various ways that women experience the war, particularly thinking Black women, free Black women, Indigenous women. And it's really exciting because there's so much more to be done there that I think can really help move the conversation beyond Republican mothers, right, which has dominated it for so long.
So I just co-sign what Lauren said. And and give a shout out to Nadine Zimmerly at the University of Virginia Press, who I think has done amazing work in cultivating scholarship on women in the Revolutionary period. I taught Cindy Kerner's most recent book just a couple of weeks ago in my freshman survey. It's very fine. Lauren and I were in a collection that Holly Mayer edited at UVA. There was also a collection that Barbara Oberg edited, and Charlene Lewis did one. And then both Amy Flugrad-Jackish and Sam Snyder are writing biographies of the Willing sisters, Elizabeth and Mary. And so I'm excited about that work. I think also, Karen Cook Bell's work to me was really transformational in thinking about the Revolutionary period from the point of view of self-emancipating enslaved women. And I think generally intersectionality has had such a transforming impact on scholarship. Also, when I started, everybody had to have a quantitative piece in their work. You had to have some tables and do like will analysis or, family composition charts and that kind of thing. And I don't think people are doing a whole lot of that anymore, but the sensitivity to environmental history and to material culture, I think that has been, really exciting work. And so, Zara Anna-Soslin's work on that front has kind of been at the forefront of that. But generally, I think that has been an important pivot in how people write about early American history, general, the early South, and women in the Revolutionary period, thinking more about environment and especially material culture, and maybe not worrying so much anymore about, I think it might have been called the Princeton Life Tables. Maybe we don't worry about that anymore.
Thank you so much for those answers. I think the SHA just published, and if you haven't had a chance to look at it, in the new journal, I just got it last week, a special issue about teaching, and I think that's a really important conversation or question to also bring up. So I think you all have included so many great answers on sort of where the field's going, all the complexities that are in the field of the study of the American Revolution. But how do you think we can take all of this and put it into the sort of standard undergraduate American Revolution class? I mean, I teach this class. I'm sure many people on the call also teach this class. So I'd, personally be really interested in how you think of that. And then I'll ask you about graduate education as well, but especially how would you take this and put it into an undergraduate course?
Do you want to go, Lori?
I can. So, first of all, I think it's fantastic that the journal did that. The organization has also, in the last 2 or 3 years, created a committee on teaching. That is, Jen Ritterhouse is chairing that, and they're like building into the program, both in Kansas City and in St. Pete Beach, building into the program panels focused on teaching, trying to build better connections with K through 12 teachers. And I think that's really important for both the journal and the organization to be involved in. So I taught the American Revolution in the spring for the first time since 2010. It's just the nature of my job here that I don't teach a lot of 3,000 level, advanced undergraduate classes. And one of the things I did is I showed the students in the spring of 26 the syllabus from the spring of 2010. And, my thinking about what was important to do in a class, it just couldn't be any more different. I had designed the class, 16 years ago to tell one narrative. I mean, to Lauren's very good point, I had like one narrative. It was, the political intellectual narrative. It had a moral arc to it. It had a beginning, a middle, and an end. I had 2 days, I think, on the war. And one of those, I'm pretty sure we watched that PBS documentary because I was like, what's that got to do with anything? And then this spring, instead of one narrative, I have 4. And I did here's what here's the traditional narrative, maybe the one you learned in high school. And then we did Native American history, we did African American history, and we close with, state formation at the end. But woven through all of that was a strong line of gender history. So, you know, I think when I started being a professor, we had a monopoly on esoteric knowledge, and the students would have to show up to get our insights if they, unless they want to go to the library and spend days and days on end trying to figure out this, that, and the other. They had to come to our class. Well, now all of that is, like it's right here all the time, any information they might want. And so now I think we teach more historical methods, historical thinking skills, research approaches, and the expansion of our historiography fits that beautifully. And so I was a little sheepish about what I'd done a long time ago, but I felt better about what I did this spring.
But to Lori's point, right, I think the revolution really lends itself to teaching historiography to undergraduates, right? Because you can kind of trace out all those different narratives and approaches and kind of expand beyond the textbook narrative in ways that is like very relatable and accessible for students, I think. And in addition to kind of co-signing everything Lori said, I think that there's also been a bunch of really great books published in recent years, a lot of biographies, right, or kind of crossover type books written about the revolution, about family history, about women's history, like Serena Zabin's book or Eric Armstrong Dunbar's book about Ona Judge, right? And I think those teach really well as well, right? Kind of bringing students into the more human, everyday, kind of day-to-day life aspects of the revolution. And I think that can really coexist alongside the political narratives, right? Because I think just at the time, right, war, politics, domestic life, we're all deeply entwined for the people living through it. And I think some of the ways that I frame my classes is to try to bring that in it as well, right? Because the revolution is this brutal civil war that's primarily waged among civilians, right? Most people are experiencing the war not in state houses, although that's very important too, right? But in their households. And so really kind of showing how these domestic and political concerns can like exist alongside each other, right? Because war is really upending daily life, right? And I think the primary sources for the revolution are especially good for teaching in this way, right? Because the war fundamentally separates families, right, to an unprecedented degree. And that's great for historians because what it means is we have all of this documentation about how people are navigating the war, what it means for their families, conversations that maybe would have happened over the dinner table about kind of household management, right, like day-to-day life, are suddenly being put in letters, right? And you can kind of juxtapose those with what's happening at the broader political and military scales, right? And kind of use it as a way to think about how people are understanding this period, right? So for instance, John and Abigail Adams, right, have all of these letters back and forth about the smallpox epidemic ravaging Boston that's happening at the exact same moment Congress is debating the Declaration, right, and debating independence. Or Elizabeth Drinker, who kept this meticulous diary through her life, right, really documents the process of negotiating quarters with a British officer, right, and kind of what it's like to live alongside him. Kind of lays out all the rules she set for him that he abides by while he lives in her house, right? He's not drinking, swearing, gambling, and kind of just gives us a snapshot, right, of what kind of how the politics, right, how war is integrating into people's daily lives. And there's the same, if we're talking about like enslaved families, right? You have so many newspaper advertisements showing that people are fleeing with their kin, right? That they're using this moment to take action to protect their loved ones. And so I think there's ways to kind of show through the primary sources, right? Kind of how people are both thinking about the politics, right, in the broader revolution that's happening at the ideological level, but also how they're just navigating day-to-day life, right? And that the two don't exist in separate spheres, but for most people are deeply connected, right? And I think for students, that's something that's really compelling because it's more relatable, right? It doesn't necessarily upend the traditional political narrative, but it helps us better flesh out the world that people inhabited. And I think that makes the revolution seem a bit more human, a bit more complicated in a way that really lends itself to teaching.
I mean, I just couldn't agree any more about that. And it seems to me recognizing that there's a familial, a personal context for, these political actions that we've sometimes uprooted out of all context. I mean, that makes them more relatable and in a way more admirable. I mean, in an excellent, another excellent example is while Jefferson's working on the draft of the Declaration of Independence, his wife is pregnant and very, very sick back in Virginia. And so if you read his material, read Jefferson's writings at the time, he's desperate to get back to Virginia. And then I think it's the same day that the Second Continental Congress votes. I think it's the second. He gets a letter back from Virginia that she's had a miscarriage, that she's okay now, but they've lost the child. And so, like, this is going on in the mind of a 33-year-old who's got a responsibility in Virginia and a responsibility at the Second Continental Congress, and separating them out is distortive.
I couldn't agree more. Right? And I think there's one letter that comes to mind as you were talking that John Adams writes kind of while he's in Philadelphia, talking about the battles happening in Boston, right? And he says, the sound of bombs is so much worse hundreds of miles away than it was when I was in it, because I can just only imagine the worst case that's happening to my family, right? And so you're right, like you can't superficially or artificially disentangle politics from the rest of it, because these are really complicated people, right?
And those materials are all available for us to bring into our classrooms through Founders Online. I mean, I hope that remains a going thing the way it has historically, but it was, I think generally digitization has so democratized scholarship and so enriched teaching. And Founders Online is one of my favorite examples of that. And, if you want to learn about Washington's leadership, it's there. But, if you want to learn about smallpox or about women's experiences or about flights to freedom, like all those things are woven into those materials, word searchable and open access. So that's we also are up against the very sticky myths of what the Revolutionary War was and what the American Revolution was, because of the I think all those romantic paintings that got done in the 19th century, like everybody knows immediately what I'm talking about. Those get sticky. And so going to the actual sources of what it was like to be in the war, to live through this tumultuous, years and years and years of ordeals is that's a good exercise for all of us, I think, to go back to the sources.
Yeah. And I'll also put a plug in for the American Philosophical Society and the Historical Society of Pennsylvania have launched this Revolutionary City portal that has digitized so many of the Philadelphia sources. It's another great thing to use in teaching.
And the Museum of the American Revolution and Mount Vernon and Monticello all have this amazing websites with like an endless, seems to me, amount of material that's accessible. Sometimes I think, for all the trouble we had with COVID, I like that saying, no problem comes without a gift in its hand. And as we all had to pivot online, and historical sites and museums did as well, that has remained for us to use in our own scholarship and in our teaching.
Yeah. The other one that's pretty great that I've actually just begun exploring in my own research is currently the National Archives have made all of the pension records freely available. Because they're actually, I believe they're kind of doing some community transcription and might actually, don't quote me on this, but I think they're doing some stuff with AI to see how that works. And so, but because of that, you can actually access all the pension records at the moment as well, which is great because usually they're behind a paywall unless you go to the archives. So
yeah. I wonder if Freedom on the Move is going to experiment with AI too. I use Freedom on the Move a lot in research and in teaching, and I think it's an amazing repository, and it's kind of crowdsourced as well. But I wonder if they're going to experiment and what AI is going to mean for all these projects we love.
Yeah, no, but I think you're right. Kind of the pandemic really did kind of spur this mass digitization that has been unbelievable for making primary sources accessible. Particularly, I know, Lorri, as well, we kind of teach far from the centers of a lot of the revolutionary archives. And so it's great to be able to kind of bring those into our classrooms and expose students to them.
Absolutely.
Wow, that was, I mean, really helpful for me. I'm sure it was really helpful for everyone else. Anything you think you want to reflect on about how this would relate to like teaching graduate students or graduate education in general? This work on this new work coming out on women in the American Revolution, and more of a focus on the family.
Well, when I read Lauren's book, I thought, how does she know that? And then like you go to the footnotes, you're like, wait a minute, where is that material? And so I do think the opening up of archives, I mean, I still, feel longing for the days where we had to go to the archive and sit in silence for weeks on end. I mean, I was thinking when I started, I had to go to the South Caroliniana Library, and the first day was just at the card catalog. Like you could forget starting anything. You had to, go through the card catalog. Um, and I kind of like sitting quietly all day long, several days in a row, reading manuscripts. I don't even mind the white gloves, but a lot of people don't have the time or the circumstances or the money, or the support out of their institutions to do that kind of work. And so I think that has made all kinds of materials available for doing research. And then the ways in which people can do research. I mean, if you think about research into newspapers, into like after 1790 into the census. I mean, the things that used to take people forever to sort through are become much more manageable, and then the interpretations are so much richer for having been more comprehensive because of searchability. So all of that, I think, is a rich opportunity for people who are starting their careers.
And I think one of the real things that I found in my own research, right, kind of this return to the war, I think actually is a great way to talk about method with graduate students as well, right? Because so for my own work, I write about occupation during the revolution and particularly looking at households. And so many of my sources are British military sources, right? There's things that historians of women and gender haven't really looked at. Often military historians were not particularly interested in kind of the women who are all over these sources, right? That kind of pop up. And so there's a way in which kind of going back to old sources with new questions, right, can kind of illuminate things that we maybe didn't notice before, right, or stories that we hadn't thought to look for. And I think that kind of particularly gender history, I think, is really innovative in that way, right, and kind of bringing methodologies to well-trodden stories and sources that kind of make us think about it in new ways. And I think that a lot of the recent scholarship on women in the revolution would lend itself really well to a graduate course to kind of think about how we reorient these stories in ways that are still operating along that traditional kind of textbook narrative that we know, but that kind of broaden our understanding of kind of what's possible, what we can know, who's part of this story.
And this is not directly about that, but circling back to where we began. One of the really exciting things, I think, in scholarship generally, and this is certainly in Homefront, is innovating with geography, right? Like, so we're here for the Southern Historical Association, and I mean, there's certainly many people who self-identify as Southern historians and study traditionally geographically, I guess, like the antebellum South or the states that seceded from the United States. But if you look at the journal, and if you look at, books that are reviewed in the journal, and if you look at the conference program, so the intersection of Southern regions, Southern cities with other places and spaces has been so transformational, I think. So not just comparative work, but people are no longer asking the same kinds of questions. And so they're looking more broadly geographically. And so, Lauren, I would say, is a Southern historian. Yes and no, like yes and more than that. So her work absolutely speaks to understanding the history of South Carolina, the history of Charleston, the history of the later stages of the Revolutionary War. But it shows that in a broader geographic context. And I think that has been very important. And I think for people, again, starting their careers in graduate school, I think that is necessary, and it's now possible because of digitization projects and museum and public sites working to make their materials more accessible.
I know I said I'd wait to the end for this question, Lori, but you brought it up. Any panels that you're particularly excited about since you mentioned the upcoming conference?
Yeah, so there's a panel on teaching Latino history in the South, and I really need to know more about that. So I'm looking forward to that. I always go to the SAWH. That talk is always fantastic. The program committee has put together a poster session this year. I think it's the first time the SHA has done a poster session, and Angela Elder is one of the folks who's presenting her work. She works at Converse, and it's on Converse College. And so, I want to see how the poster session works. I want to learn, new and different things. And so those are some of the things that I'm excited about, right now.
And I think, unfortunately, I won't be at the conference, and I'm really disappointed looking at the program. It just looks absolutely phenomenal, and I'm sad to miss it. In particular, there's a panel, I think it's Saturday morning, on Southern Black intimacies. It was space, place, and kinship, which I thought just looked really fabulous and also relevant to our conversation here today, as well as one on Friday about Black families and slavery and freedom. I think there's one on Southern First Ladies. It just looks like there's a great program that's been put together, and it's going to be some really fabulous conversations this weekend.
And our, point about repositories and online materials, there's a panel on the National Park Service. And, they have done amazing work with public facing history and, very, very rich scholarship, I think. And so that's another panel I want to go to and see, what's going on with the NPS. It has a rather melancholy title, as I remember. So, but if I were in the National Park Service right about now, I'd probably be a little melancholy too.
And I guess during the time that we have for questions, I'll ask anyone to bring up a panel that you're particularly excited about and pitch it if you want to. The two final questions that we've thought about talking, or they're both public facing. So the first one is in preparation for our event, Lori mentioned that historians are now doing more to incorporate public facing elements into our scholarship. How are historians of the American Revolution doing this?
I mean, I think kind of just broadly speaking, like one of the great things about doing family history is that so many historic sites are houses, right? And so they're ready made to tell these stories. And I think I've seen in my own classes, right, in my own public events, that there's a real appetite for these types of stories of family, of personal histories. And I think that the anniversary really gives us an opportunity to kind of get out and share those stories. And not saying anything innovative here, right, but kind of doing public talks, working with public historians, working with teachers, right? Because I think our narratives of the revolution as scholars have become a lot more complicated in really interesting ways, right? And I think every time I teach kind of Lori's, her work on Eliza Lucas Pinckney, right? And this idea that we need to think of her as the planter patriarch, right? That we kind of really need to think differently about maybe the misconceptions we have about how gender operated can really be in practice a lot more complicated and nuanced, right? And I think that there's a lot of opportunities to have those conversations to really think about the revolution as this drawn out process that encompassed all different types of people. And just kind of getting out there and having those conversations is a great way to kind of start doing some of that work.
So I give a talk at the Southern, which I'm a little nervous about, but mostly excited. And at the end of that, I talk about the importance as we face 250 of countering distortive, exclusionary, narratives about history, mythologies about the founding with good scholarship. And I think I like a lot of people, I follow Ben Franklin's world. I also have a friend who does a podcast called Too Complicated for History. So I think that kind of work, I think the work of public historians at historic sites and historic homes, the way that Lauren was describing, is very good. So, I am hopeful, guardedly hopeful, but I feel it really is necessary because we are facing a tremendous assault on public historic sites, pedagogy, and it's all being, attempted to be skewed toward white nationalism. And I think that's just profoundly damaging to our civic life. And to history. It's a violence to history. And so, I'm hopeful that the good work that people have been doing over the last decade on that front, will continue.
Yeah.
Yeah, and sort of along those lines, Laura, I'm interested to see how do you think we should be commemorating the 250th anniversary? I mean, I think your point about contesting these exclusionary mythologies, contesting white supremacy, that makes so much sense and I think is really important. For those of you that haven't read it, there's a really great forum in the journal Early Republic that just came out about this very thing of how to think about the 250th anniversary. So anything that you have, Lauren or Lorri, about this celebration, commemoration of this event?
Lorri, do you want to go?
I didn't hear you. Do you want me to go or do you want to go?
Yeah, do you want to go?
Okay, so I actually do quite a lot of work with Mount Vernon and teacher training in the summer, and Mount Vernon is launching a big initiative to go to all the 50 states and partner with K through 12 teachers and scholars at historic sites to try and present a much more broadened, much more inclusive kind of history, which is just good history. And a friend of mine and I, Kate Elizabeth Brown, and I are doing a collection that will be out, we think, in another year. Will be out sometime in 26. And, some of the authors are teachers and librarians and public historians and scholars. And we're all reflecting on like how to teach George Washington and the founding era for in an inclusive way for the 21st century. And so, I think, my experience with Mount Vernon, I think Monticello is doing similar things. I don't work with them. But the team at Mount Vernon is very committed to meeting 250 with good history.
That's great to hear. I mean, I think this is a really good question, right? Because I think one of the things that recent scholarship has showed us, and as we've been talking about today, is just how hard it is to tell kind of one cohesive narrative of the revolution, that it looks so different in different times and different places, right? And I was thinking particularly about the South, right? Like, for instance, the war in the South is really messy, right? Not that war isn't messy elsewhere, but it looks really different than our conception of the revolution in, say, like Massachusetts, right? Where we can kind of plot the standard narrative to the outbreak of war and Lexington and Concord, and then the Minutemen, right? And the war in the South just looks so different. And part of this is chronology, because it's the end of the war, right? But it also has to do with geography, with imperial competition, right? And I think, Georgia, for instance, is the only colony to revert to crown rule, which is unique among the 13 colonies, right? They're really different racial dynamics because there's a large enslaved population, really powerful indigenous nations, geographic expanse. And so I think really also being attentive to, in this kind of attentive public history, right, but kind of place matters, right? And kind of how we tell those stories in specific places can give us a different, messier view of the war, right, in ways that I think opens the door to having conversations about complexity, right? And some of these conversations are much needed, as Lorri said, right, to push back on some of these narratives that are being promoted right now, and instead to really encourage people to lean into some of the tensions at the heart of the founding, right? To expand our understanding of the revolution is not only a historical event that's laid in with kind of contingency and complexity and subtleties and nuance, right? But that it's also an opportunity to have conversations about the hopes and aspirations of the many, many people who were involved in the revolution, who navigated it in different ways, and the legacies of all those stories for this moment, right? As we engage in this collective ongoing project of democracy. And I think this is something that really gets to what that JER forum was talking about that Lucas mentioned. And I think Serena Zabin and others were talking about, that the 250th really gives us a moment to not only tell this history in vital ways, but to also recommit to our communities, right? To kind of engage in civic action that's deeply rooted in the ideals of the revolution, and kind of do our best to not only promote that knowledge, but also improve our own little corner of the world in the ways we can. And I think things like what Lorri's doing at Mount Vernon sounds fabulous. And I think looking for opportunities like that where we can bring our expertise to broader audiences is a really great way to commemorate this moment.
I mean, I also think it's just important to remember that if you're searching for models of people who love liberty and are willing to sacrifice their well-being to pursue freedom, people who are worried about themselves and their posterity and what the future will be like for them. I mean, it's very easy, I think, for us to conjure in our minds those men in velvet knee breeches in Philadelphia. But to Lauren's point about recentering women and the war, what about all of the enslaved women who ran toward the war zone because
Also
the
with
British,
children.
yeah, because the British government offered a slim promise of freedom for them and their children. And so that to me is, you know, as admirable, as worthy of our commemoration and celebration. And maybe we just do well to remember how many different kinds of people embodied admirable ideals in the many revolutions of the late 18th century.
Yeah, very well said, Lorri.
Well, thank you all so much. If this was in person, of course, this would be a time when we get to celebrate you and clap for this great conversation. So I thank you both for taking part in this. And so this is the time too when we can open it up and continue the conversation, have some audience participation. So if anyone would like to go ahead, again, I'll be monitoring the chat if you're more comfortable typing something in the chat, or feel free to just ask your question to our great panelists.
I'll say something if I may. My name is Alyssa Faison. I'm Lauren's colleague at the University of Oklahoma. And thank you for this fascinating conversation. I'm particularly interested because I'm I guess Lorri's generation and of an era where women's and gender history, which I also do, was becoming more important within the historical discipline. And it had seemed to me, and still does to an extent, that military history was sort of on the decline. It was not, social history. It was not women's and gender history. It was not all these sort of cutting edge things that were coming out in the 90s and beyond. And what I think is so fascinating about what Lauren's book does is, along with other people of her generation, is to bring military history, is to recenter military history in a very different kind of way, which I think is long overdue. And so my question is how you both see the potential future of a field of American military history focusing on the Revolutionary period that more holistically, more perhaps organically takes seriously the kinds of issues about the wide variety of experiences, but not just sort of like including women and different types of women and different types of freed or unfreed people into the conversation, but also does some of the things that Lorri, you were pointing to about rethinking some of the, I guess we could say, historically primary figures who also had these aspects to their lives that were happening that have been sort of cut out of the narrative for so long. Sorry, that's hugely broad, and I don't know what kind of a question it is, but I'm just going to stop there.
Well, I think it's a very good and a very important question. And I think people are already, I mean, in a way, people have done some version of this off and on But there does seem to be like over time, but there does seem to be a critical mass of people who are doing it now. I mean, Lauren, Jackie Beatty is doing some really fascinating work on this. I tried to do some of it with the Eliza Pinckney book, and that's, the big part of what I'm going to talk about at the Southern. But to move away from the romance of war is the first critical step. And so I think that's the first key step. But there's been so much exciting work that's been done. In a way, we just have to exploit it.
And I think one of the things, particularly around the revolution, is, dating back to almost the war itself, right? Kind of there's this idea that the revolution is separate from the war, right? There's a really famous John Adams quote that like the revolution was affected before the war began, right? And in a lot of ways, that's a kind of sidelined the war from so much of the history, right? That it's, for a long time, a lot of emphasis, rightly so, on the politics and the ideals and kind of the rhetoric and the ideology of the revolution. But I think what adding military history back in does is kind of helps us flesh out the world in which those ideas were articulated, right? And to say that, like, yes, all of those things mattered and they were hugely important. But this is also a brutal civil war that lasts 8 years, right? And that there isn't this kind of bifurcation between a battlefront and a home front that we associate with maybe later American wars, right? This is a war waged in and among communities that has, drastic effects for everyone who comes in contact with it. And so many people who are drawn into its orbit. And to really think about the revolution as a societal experience, right? That's not just something that happened on the battlefield or in the Continental Congress, but that it touches the lives of almost everyone who lives through it, right? In ways that sometimes bring opportunity, but also can bring disaster, right? Or violence. And to really kind of hold both ideas at once, right? That people can experience these changes on the broader scale that's happening transformationally in the revolution, but that it's also a really scary time for a lot of people and that both things happen. And I think looking at the war and the military history helps us see that in a way that's really, really helpful.
And, it just went on a long time. I mean, 8 years is a long time, a tremendous amount of loss. And, not forever, but all the forever a lot of people had.
And I think there's one quote I love. It's a young woman, right, in New York who actually ends up marrying a loyalist or a continental prisoner. I'm sorry, she's a loyalist. She marries a continental prisoner. And a woman kind of gives her a hard time about this relationship. And she says, this war is not going to last forever, but it might outlast my youth, right? And so this idea that like life goes on for people, even as war is ending, that there's so much more to life that is also kind of worth exploring is how people are kind of living day to day, even as war is upending their worlds.
I have a question. So thank you both for such a great conversation. And Lorri, I'm really gonna remember and use that, how many people embodied admiral ideals in the many revolutions. I think that's a really rich way of being able to capture all the diverse stories in a meaningful sort of way. But my question for you is, as we think about the forces changing women's lives in all sorts of women at this time, and one of the things that you said, Lauren, was not just due to political ideology, but due to the war itself, right? The experience, the lived everyday experience of the war. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how, once we understand that these forces are broader and richer, how that helps us to think about the trajectory of the change in their lives. Does that trajectory, do we have to tell a different story about that trajectory of change, or are we just kind of coming at it from a broader set of sources that will help us to understand, but it's a similar trajectory, if that makes sense?
That does makes a lot of sense. And I think it's both, right? Like it gives us a different perspective on the war, which I think is in itself, it's really important to kind of just adding layers and nuance to like where the war happens, who's part of that story, right? But I think long term, and this is one of the things that I get into more in my book, is to say that it really matters for Americans that war invades the most intimate spaces, right? It upends their households. It upends kind of the way they move through the streets, right? And that experience is, I think, one of the things that really comes out of these primary sources. It can be for some people, right? So for a lot of white householders, right, it's deeply disorienting, right? Feeling that they're no longer in charge of their households, that they cannot trust the people that they employ are enslaved because the British Army is now here and offers these alternatives, whether it's hiring domestic servants, whether it's enslaved kin freeing to British lines to pursue freedom. But there's this fundamental disruption to the patriarchal household and a lot of the ideas that undergirded revolutionary society that the war kind of throws into chaos. And so I think one of the things that for me is really important in telling the story this way is that it helps us understand the place that the household comes to have in the new nation. Right? We know that the cult of domesticity is coming, but I think one of the things that really looking at the war on the home front does is help us to see just how much of this longing for a return to normalcy, for a consolidation of power over property, over households, is something that actually comes out of the war and the destabilization that it wreaks on society. And that if we don't actually look at how war is upending all these different facets of household life, we can't actually see how much of the way that the household is constituted in the early republic is actually a reaction to the war, because it could have gone very differently, right? But we end up with this kind of ideal of people sitting under their vine and fig trees, right? Their protected households. That becomes really integral to kind of what Americans articulate that they fought the war for and how they conceptualize what independence looks like. Does that make sense?
And I would add, I think it's important to think about what independence meant to different people. And that independence is not just the break from British imperial authority. And so if you think about, when I studied Eliza Pinckney, I concluded that she was independent before the war, before the independence movement, in terms of how she defined it, which was financially secure, wealthy, and building a legacy to last across generations. For enslaved women, independence is freedom from bondage. And so I think if we think about independences from different women's perspectives, then we can think differently about what unfolds in the early republic period, right? And so the war is certainly a part of that, but I think rethinking independence is also really significant.
And it also maybe extends our chronology of it too, right? To say that it's not just these 8 years of war, but some of these doors that are opened, right, during the revolution, the fight for independence continues long past. And that it's kind of a longer history of these multiple revolutions, of which the American Revolution is part.
Yeah.
Any other questions? I have another one, but I would love to have anyone else chime in if you haven't had a chance to ask your question. I guess I'll ask mine then. So I was recently talking to a student about like how I got into studying what I study, and I think that's actually kind of an important thing to think about this because both of you came to a similar interest in the American Revolution, in women and the household at different time periods when you both were at some point in graduate school, or I imagine as an undergrad. Could you talk about what caused your interest in this field? And I don't know. I just think that's interesting to reflect on. And maybe it'll make for a great final question for our conversation.
So that is a good question. And when I became an historian, I imagined myself as an 18th century historian and a colonialist who was really interested in South Carolina. Now, those are not really designated. I don't think people think about being a colonialist anymore, but that's what I thought, what it'll be 30 years ago. And the first book I wrote was about 18th century South Carolina. And I think I'd have to look, but I think it's like 3 or 4 pages on the Revolution. That was it. I was like, that's not the story I'm telling. I'm interested in families. I'm interested in these family dynasties and power in South Carolina, and that's not really important. And certainly the war was not important, to what I was doing. And so I got a job at the University of Tennessee, and I thought I would teach colonial America. And they said, we're also going to need you to teach at the interview, they're like, we would need you to teach the American Revolution. And, I thought, if you will give me this job, I will teach the American Revolution standing on my head. So I kind of backed into it, and I found out that I really liked it, and taught a lot of different courses in that period. And so I kind of moved more into, just a different way of thinking about who I was as an historian and a writer. But it really was kind of a job requirement that turned into a great labor of love.
I think so. My experience is a little different. I grew up in Massachusetts, and so the revolution is just everywhere. Growing up from a young age, I was very interested in it. Right, I remember going on like a field trip to the Boston Tea Party ship, right, where you they actually have like the tea chest attached to rope, and you like chuck it into the harbor and then reel it back in. And so I think public history was actually a big part of how I got into the revolution, right, because it was just so omnipresent growing up around it, and particularly just thinking about women's experiences. I think like American Girl books, right, kind of got me down that path. And so really was always very interested in women's experiences during the war. But I think in particular, how I got to my project was once I was in grad school, was writing a research seminar paper and was writing about the occupation of Philadelphia, because it was kind of the closest archive I could get to about the revolution. And there's this elaborate ball that happens at the end, where British officers, called the Mischianza, British officers dress up in these medieval court costumes. There's a joust, there's this elaborate pageantry to celebrate the retirement of General Howe. And what I discovered was so much of what people had written about the occupation of Philadelphia focuses on this one night, right? And it is really interesting, right? And there's a lot of gendered imagery and kind of there's a lot to unpack. But the British Army was there for 9 months, right? I got very curious about like, well, what was happening the rest of the time, right? Like, what was it like for all of these civilians who suddenly had an army showing up and taking over their city, moving into their houses? What is it kind of day to day? What does that look like? And found that there just hadn't been much written about it. So that was my starting point. And then just got deeper and deeper into kind of looking at all the different cities and family histories as a way to really reconceptualize the war itself.
Gosh, well, thank you all so much for taking your time to do this, and for those of you in the audience, again, I think this has been an amazing conversation. So maybe once again we can give our thumbs up or virtual claps for Lauren and for Lorri. But again, I hope that this has gotten me excited. And again, like Lauren, I won't be heading to the conference, but it's getting me. I wish that I had been able to go, given how this has gotten me excited for everything. So. Anyway, I guess thank you all so much, and look forward. Some of you will be gathering in Florida in only a few days.
Thank you so much, Lucas. And thanks, Lauren. It was great to be in conversation with you.
Yeah, it was wonderful. Thank you all so much for organizing this.